The grace of God. There's much more to it than we understand, have experienced, and more than we'll ever need. That's next on Living in Christ. Pointing people to the Lord, His Word, and much more grace. This is Living in Christ with Bob Hoekstra. Welcome to our program. Today we're going to bring you a message called The Much More Grace of God. The grace of God is oftentimes misunderstood, and so many people fail to tap into the endless supply. Here to help us receive and apply God's much more grace to our lives is Pastor Bob in Romans 5:17.
Well, our study for this morning is about God's much more grace in Christ. And that phrase, much more, is not just an idea I came up with. It's a key phrase out of Romans chapter 5, where we'll be studying. Romans chapter 5, verse 17, God's much more grace in Christ. God's much more grace in Christ. God's grace certainly fits that phrase, much more. God's grace is much more than any of us, individually or collectively, have ever yet understood. It's more than we have ever yet experienced, though we may have experienced great measures of the grace of God. The grace of God is much more than is needed for a victorious, day-by-day Christian life, fruitfulness available by that much more grace. Also, the grace of God is much more than the effects of sin in our lives or others. And that's a huge matter. That's a huge matter. Stack up all the sin in the world and the sin that's impacted our lives or that we've stumbled into and through. Think of it. God's grace is much more than that. Also, God's grace is much more than simply and only forgiveness. God's grace does provide forgiveness, and without it, we would never be able to know the true and living God. But the grace of God is much more than that. As the Lord will help us and guide us here, we'll examine these issues, basically using one verse, and see that it describes the root of all of man's problems. You could say the reason for all of his defeats. But on the other hand, this verse also describes the fountain of all of God's remedies. Or we could say the resources for all of God's victories that we desperately need in our lives. Now, that's a lot of implication in one verse, but that's the kind of verse this is. Some of you who may know me a bit know I love to search out the Scriptures and find verses that are huge in their import, though they might be very few in their words. There are a lot of verses like that in the Scriptures, and where you can sort of just get a panorama of the whole kingdom of heaven graciously packaged in like one sentence or two. God is so good to do that. Life gets so big and overwhelming and so complicated, but the realities of what it's all about and what we need is astoundingly simple. Not meager, just simple. Abundant, but not complicated. Romans 5:17 is such a verse. Let's read that together if you want to follow along. For if by the one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more, there's that phrase, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. First matter in this verse, the reason for all of the defeats of human beings and humanity in general. Really the root of all of man's problems, gathered up in this one statement. For if by the one man's offense, this, of course, is speaking about Adam's sin and rebellion. When Adam sinned, the impact upon his life, his household as Eve joined in, enormous. And the day you sin, you'll die. Of course, he didn't perish physically immediately, but spiritually he did. He had walked with the Lord in the cool of the evening in the garden that God had provided. After sin came, rebellion came, transgression came, trespass of the will of God came. God called for him in the garden, he ran and he hid. Spiritual deadness of the heart. All of this is what was passed on to all of Adam's children. Those who share the life that Adam fell into and was passed along generation to generation, it all traces back. For if by the one man's offense, death reigned. And that's the huge issue. The reign of death, the rule of death over Adam and Eve, their children and their children's children, right down to us and everyone along the way who was born naturally of human parents into a share of human life that was a fallen, sinful, rebellious family. Because of that, death reigned through the one. What a consequence. And really, they had given in to the temptations of the evil one. 2 Corinthians 4:4 calls him the God of this world. And he's not a real God, he's a would-be God. There's only one true and living God who lives forever and reigns forever. But this one is a usurper. He wants to take the throne of God, and he announced, I will be like the Most High God. And he thought he should have a throne like God. He went into the garden and invited humanity, at that time just Adam and Eve, to follow after him. In John 10:10, he's called the thief. The thief comes only to rob, to kill, and to destroy. Here, the term that is used to personify him, death reigned through the one. Death reigned. This is why lives get so messed up. Sometimes we wonder, how did I get in a mess like this? It's the reign and rule of death. Not just a principle, though that reality hits us, that when we began as sinners, we were dead in trespasses and sins. Not just the concept alone, but an actual ruler who can be called death, who can be called the thief, who can be called the devil, even Satan. This is why lives get in such a tragic mess. Before I came to know the Lord, though I grew up in a godly home, I didn't respond to the things of God early on. And by the time I was in my mid-20s, my life was a distinctive mess. Really, I cannot think of any area of life that was not messed up. Some people foolishly thought I was a pretty nice person, but God kept convincing me year after year after year, right up until the crescendo of conviction crushed me, that I was a rotten sinner. Selfish, in me no good thing dwelled. My life was a mess on every front. I didn't realize it from age 15 to 25. When I plunged into the world, I didn't realize that death was reigning over me. I actually had a huge mistake. I thought I was in charge, And I could trumpet my testimony, I'm a captain of my salvation. I'm in charge of my ship. Yeah, and it was sinking. It was in desperate states. Why families get so messed up, so defeated. Why argumentation and alienation and separation and divorce and cruelty. And how does this happen? For if by the one man's offense death reigned through the one, the enemy took advantage of Adam in temptation, and Adam was not walking, staying close with God and away from the enemy, hanging around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he was told not to touch, and here comes the hissing serpent as it was made visual and physical, the presence of the enemy to tempt him to rebellion.
Romans 5:17 clearly describes the root of our problems, but as we'll soon discover, it also beautifully points us to God's remedies. Today on Living in Christ, we heard a portion of Bob Hoekstra's study, God's Much More Grace in Christ. You can listen to it in its entirety when you visit livinginchrist.org on the web, then go to Media. You can also request a CD, and we suggest a donation of $5 for that. Call us toll-free, 877-600-LICM. That's 877-600-LICM. You can also find us on YouTube now. Subscribe for free and listen when it's most convenient. Just search for Living in Christ Ministries. Pastor Bob has written 365 daily devotions on the grace of God, one for each day of the year. Grow in grace right along with us. You can find today's reading at livinginchrist.org when you click on Devotional. You might also want to order the Day by Day by Grace coffee mug. Enjoy a cup of coffee with your morning devotions. That too is available at livinginchrist.org. And we'd love to hear how God is using this daily radio broadcast in your life. In fact, it would make our day. You can email us through the website at livinginchrist.org. And here's our mailing address, Living in Christ, P.O. Box 2848, Costa Mesa, California, 92628. And again, our toll-free number, 877-600-LICM. Pastor Bob Hoekstra will pick up where we left off today in his study, God's Much More Grace in Christ, right here next time. We invite you to return for that. Living in Christ is brought to you by Living in Christ Ministries.